Welcome in, everybody. I'm Dan Wiederer from the Chicago Tribune, joined by my good friend Dionne Miller of ABC 7 Chicago. We are still in the heart of Combine Week from the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. We are obviously back in Chicago after stops in Indianapolis, and there is a lot to talk about with your Chicago Bears. Dionne, how you doing?
I'm good. As I left Indy before all the stuff came out with Jalen Carter, and I want to know from ground level what that was like, because of the way that everybody views him, obviously, as the top overall prospect.
Yeah, so this is layered, and it was where I wanted to start our discussion to begin with, because obviously Wednesday morning, I believe it was, that Jalen Carter was supposed to meet with the media for a interview session, and it was not more than 2.5 hours before that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, with some really great journalism and reporting on everything that was connected with Jalen Carter's potential involvement in a fatal car accident in Georgia in January, came out. And so then the question was, is Jalen Carter going to still attend his podium session? I think the presumption was no, he's not, but you still had to have 200 plus media members surrounding podium one there in that convention center just in case. And so everyone was just kind of waiting it out. And then more details emerged about the warrant being out for Jalen Carter's arrest. He obviously returned to Georgia, turned himself in, charges of reckless driving and racing. And it's more than that, though, Dionne, because there's obviously some things from that night, whether it's via surveillance video or contradictory reports given to police that give you pause. And just so our audience knows, this is Jalen Carter being potentially involved in a car accident that took the lives of two people that were part of the Georgia football program, very shortly after the Bulldogs won the national championship. And so there's some very serious things within this. And the charges that he was arrested for or the warrant was put out for are misdemeanors. And that's fine. But as an NFL team thinking about making him the headliner of your 2023 draft class, this creates a ton of homework. And so I guess my first question for you is, if you're Ryan Poles, how do you adapt, and what are your steps now going forward over the next month and a half as you're trying to figure out if Jalen Carter is somebody you even still want to consider with the number one pick?
Well, my first reaction, Dan, is that he's not going to get drafted. He's not going to get drafted as high now. And that's my first human reaction. But my NFL history reaction reminds me that never say never, right? Like, this is a league that I believe will forgive and forget if he can play football. Now, is that the right move? I don't know. Is it a move I think the Bears will make? I do not. I feel like what we know of Poles and Matt Eberflus is they made it very clear this week that what they are looking for is high character guys who love football. And this side story that is going to accompany Jalen Carter into the NFL and forever, how long it does, maybe forever, is nothing they want to bring into their locker room. What did Matt Eberflus say the biggest progress they made, or something he's the proudest of in his first season as head coach? Culture. Yeah. Why would you bring in a guy that would bring that into question for anyone who's already in that locker room?
That's where I'm at personally. Now, we don't have a whole lot to judge Ryan Poles on. We don't know what his track record is. We don't know what the risk aversion or risk tolerance is in a case like this. And it's going to be layered, because you're going to have to probably involve someone like Kevin Warren, your new team president, who probably wants to have at least some input in what the assessment is going into the draft. Now, I had people in Indy tell me, to everyone's benefit, this came out in early March, and it didn't come out on April 23rd, a week before the draft, which would have sent everyone scrambling and in a crisis mode, because this was a surprise to a lot of people. And look, even before this incident, even before all of this stuff became public with this very, very specific transgression, there were some character concerns. Todd McShay brought that up a couple months ago and got skewered for using those words, but there were thoughts around the league that look like there is some maturity issues here. There is a level of risk that you're going to take on with Jalen Carter. This elevates it times 3, times 4, times 5. Yes. And now, to your point, and what I would piggyback on top of that with is, if you're going to talk about culture, if you're going to talk about passion for the game, if you're going to talk about leaders, well, you've got another guy sitting there on the defensive side of the ball that would fill a need, Will Anderson from Alabama, who by all accounts has a sparkling football character and is a guy that would fit in very well with all the things that Matt Eberflus is wishing for. And so potentially, you can have that sigh of relief or that feeling of reassurance that, okay, like, this isn't a one player and one player only draft. and we've got other guys we like, so go down that route, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean the juxtaposition of a Jalen Carter who's gets bailed out and then came back to Indianapolis, which another topic. I did not anticipate him returning to Indy, but he did. And then Will Anderson, who's answering questions respectfully, and he's just the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like to me, that is a no-brainer. It's just a no-brainer. If you really want to build a franchise that is going to sustain that kind of success, how many times have we heard this, Dan, throughout our careers? It has to start with chemistry in the locker room. It has to. I know not everybody's going to get along with everybody, but you can't have someone in there that everybody's kind of looking over their shoulder and wondering if he's a good guy or a bad guy. They don't have time for that. And and obviously with Jalen Carter, it was just a couple weeks ago that he was being asked, are you a good teammate? Are you really, is this true about you, that you aren't a great teammate? And he didn't want to answer the questions. It just doesn't, it feels icky to me. And that's a horrible description, but it just feels like, why would we do this if we have a choice not to?
But to your other point, you have a football background, and you know that Deshaun Watson signed the richest contract an NFL quarterback ever signed, with everything swirling around him. League personnel forgets, and they forgive really quickly, much more than the public does. Joe Mixon coming into the draft was on video punching a woman. Yeah. That's in the background really quickly. You know, Tyreek Hill played in Kansas City. He had several incidents, and Ryan Poles was a part of that. And so it's just a kind of wait and see game. And I do think it will be interesting, even after the draft, if the Bears don't unite with Jalen Carter at 1, at 4, at 6, wherever it may be, just to see how they went through this process. It'll be worth following up with people inside the building who are part of the process, just to know what were your processes, because these are a test for an administration to figure out what exactly you're after. It's a big, big deal. The draft has so many compelling storylines to it. I think one of the other ones that we've been following as we get into this weekend is the quarterback class. I think everyone's under the presumption that the Bears have pretty much cemented Justin Fields in as their starter for 2023. But Bryce Young is out there, and Will Levis is out there, and Anthony Richardson is out there, and CJ Stroud is out there. And so the Bears doing their homework on that class is really interesting. And the Bryce Young story to me is fascinating because the reviews of him as a football player are glowing. And then the only question anyone has is he big enough to withstand a beating, getting chased around by grown-ass men for 17 weeks every season?
Well, it depends. Is the Bears' offensive line his offensive line? Because no one wants to see that for him. And that would be a grand challenge. I guess I go back to, like, Ryan Poles is still playing his cards, right? I mean, he's not going to go out there and give this like endorsement slam dunk on Justin Fields when he knows that there are teams who want a quarterback who he wants to get some assets for that number 1 overall pick. So we're going to hear a lot of this strategy, I think, for another couple of weeks before we get closer to the draft to see, but they will do their due diligence, and they absolutely should. You never know what could happen. You never know if Justin could get injured, or they need to do that. Know these quarterbacks, whether they believe they're a good fit for right now, or maybe just to keep in the back of their minds for later.
Couple pieces of intel I wanted to share and pick your brain on a little bit from the combine. Number one is there was someone said to me, look, like there's an understandable glee in Chicago over what they have a chance to do this offseason with the number 1 pick, the draft capital, the free agency money, but that the way you get there is to have a historically bad football team. The Bears were historically bad. They lost a franchise record 10 games in a row to close the season. They lost 14 overall. They were really bad. And so the counterpoint that this person pointed out to me is that, look, like, you could have been a 6-win football team and come to a contract agreement long-term with Roquan Smith as a core building block of your defense and your team. You could have been a 6-win football team, and Velus Jones could have been a player that showed up as an every week's difference maker, as a guy you could plan with for the future. You could have been a 6-win football team and had Trevis Gibson emerge as a legitimate number 2 pass rusher, which diminishes your needs there. And so this sort of celebration that, we got 14 losses in the number 1 pick overlooks the fact that you could have won 6 games and filled a bunch of these holes that you're now trying to fill with this draft capital you got. And I thought that was really interesting.
Well, yeah, you could see the glee on Ryan Poles' face, and there is a feeling that somehow the Bears won something, but we can't like we've talked about before. They didn't lose all those games because it was fun. Like they need to get something for that. That's because that's just their reality. And now we have to start finding the right pieces. It is disappointing that they could have had more victories and been in a different position, but they're not. So we have to operate with what we know. What we know is that they have so many needs that they could go a number of different directions with free agency coming up and start to put some pieces back together. It's disappointing that they didn't take advantage of having Roquan Smith on the roster and in the locker room, but they did not want to. They did not want to. That was very clear. I think that Ryan Poles made that very clear. He's like, this is not a direction I want to go in. So he has those convictions, and we'll see how he utilizes that now in a full free agency with full draft picks galore to figure out exactly how he wants to build his team.
Not full draft picks, and wait on that because I've got more on that topic. I spoke with Jim McBride, a friend of the program of the Boston Globe, who was stunned when I told him that Bears win at Foxborough was their last win of the season.
Was their last win. I know.
He goes, wait a second, wasn't that late October? I said, yes, it was late October. And we got all the way to January 8th without the Bears winning another football game. So along with that, to the Roquan Smith discussion and the draft pick discussion, the Bears don't have their second-round draft pick. They traded it, which is now number 32 overall, to the Pittsburgh Steelers for Chase Claypool. I bring that up because they acquired or they traded Roquan Smith and acquired the Ravens draft pick in that deal, a second-round pick there. But they had to trade their own draft pick to Pittsburgh to get Chase Claypool. This resonates around the league because there's a sense that there's a real sweet spot from late day 1 to early day 3 of this draft, from late in the first round into early in the fourth round, that has a ton of value in it. Well, the Bears, depending on what they do, right, as it stands now, they don't have anything in their back pocket between number 1 and the late 50s. And so there are going to be a lot of really talented Bears fit players that come flying off the board between 1 and the late 50s that they're not going to have a chance to swing at unless they accumulate more picks. And so I think, to some extent, that almost necessitates the push to deal this number 1 pick at all costs so you can add stuff for this year, for next year, potentially for 2025, to make sure that you're not missing out on these sweet spots of talent with a roster that is just full of holes.
Did you hear that conspiracy that the Bears strategically wanted to put out there, that they would be willing to, they're thinking about trading the pick? We all knew they were going to do that. Was that part of the strategy because they didn't have much going on? They wanted it out there so that people would start calling them? I don't know.
No, listen, I do think that the Bears are certainly beating that drum a lot to national media outlets to create the impression. It's the smart thing to do strategically, that if you want to come up to number 1, there's going to be competition there. The only way you can do that legitimately is if you've had conversations with 2 teams that have said, hey, we're potentially interested in that. But I think there has been some exaggeration based on people that I talked to, based on people my colleague Brad Biggs at the Tribune talked to in Indianapolis, that there is not at the top of this draft these must-have players that teams are just clamoring to come flying up and giving up assets for. I think the Bears can trade that number 1 pick, but I don't think it is this intense feeding frenzy auction that's going to go on as it stands right now. Obviously, it's all fluid between now and late April, but it's going to be interesting to watch that unfold.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like what you just said really got me there. It is. I feel like it is necessary for them to trade that pick and acquire some assets between 1 and 50. They need more of those top tier talent guys that can come in, and they need so much that it feels like it can be anywhere. It just has to be closer to the top.
Yeah. Well, and look, if you had number 32, it would be nice, but you have Chase Claypool instead. And we have to make sure that we keep that in the back of our heads and in our analysis for the next 8 months to see what Chase Claypool does, because we know his production was not real impressive in his short time with the Bears. And now he's got to make it impressive so people forget that, oh boy, the Bears basically traded the equivalent of the final pick of the first round to the Pittsburgh Steelers to have a guy that hopefully becomes part of their future, but we don't know if that's going to happen at this point.
Let's hope the fact that he was asked about that and we're trying to hold him accountable has been some sort of fuel for him for the offseason. Please.
No doubt.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. All right.
You and I talked about this earlier in the week. The Bears are relevant again, and it's not always the case heading into the draft. So that was fun to feel that in Indianapolis with people actually pursuing you to be like, hey, what are the Bears going to do? As opposed to just being like, oh, yeah, hey, the Bears are still in the league, So that was a fun little twist for the week in Indy. And it's going to continue for the next 2 months,
It is, but officially it's not a position I want to be in every year. Let's just say that.
Definitely not. That's Dionne. I'm Dan. Thanks for joining us. Like, subscribe. We'll have more content as this crazy offseason continues.